Good morning, and thank you all for joining today's Humanities webinar presented by the New York Botanical Garden. The New York Botanical Garden is located in the ancestral homeland of the Lenape, or the Delaware people, and we honor them and acknowledge their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. I'm Vanessa Sellers, Director of the Humanities Institute, and together with my colleague Charles Zimmerman, it's my great pleasure to welcome you from locations across the United States and around the world to explore new visions of botanical history, the title of this year's Andrew W. Mellon Fellows presentations. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Kathleen Gutierrez and Dr. Jackson Perry, whom we have been very lucky to have here at the Botanical Gardens to do their studies this year as Mellon Fellows. Today, they will offer a research progress report showing how they have worked at the garden and how they have benefited from the historical collections of the LuEsther T Mertz Library and William and Lynda Steere Herbarium to further their interdisciplinary research. Their studies stimulate critical thinking at the intersection of science and humanities, and also highlight some salient points related to our Institute's new focus, the food humanities. Our first speaker is Dr. Kathleen Gutierrez. She comes to us from UC Berkeley, where she received her PhD in Southeast Asian Studies with a designated emphasis in science and technology studies. Her dissertation on the international consolidation of botany from 1858 to 1936 was shortlisted as a best dissertation in the humanities by the International Convention of Asian Scholars in 2021. She's now broadening her research for a new manuscript that has already received an advanced offer of review. And this morning she will trace the New York Botanical Garden's own long relationship with the Philippines under Britain and Merrill, asking the question, how can we expand the definition of the vernacular in the history of botany to account for the way that plant knowledge was expressed and transformed in a place like the Philippines? Here now is Dr. Gutierrez.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I believe that should be sharing my screen now. Yep, yeah. Okay, great. So good morning, and thank you so much for having us. So as introduced, I'm Kath Gutierrez, and I'm working at the NYBG, which has been a real fortunate opportunity, to say the least, which has also felt like coming full circle in a way. I've shared this with other colleagues here, but my father, who is a Philippine botanist and specialist of the Dipterocarpaceae, commonly known there as Philippine mahogany, first visited the NYBG in the mid-1960s to review the collection in the Herbarium. At the time, one of a handful of specialized Philippine repositories in the United States. This not only speaks to the profound breadth of the Herbarium that we find even up to today, but also to the long historical relationship the institution has had to the Philippines that began in the early to mid 20th century. So for this morning's brief talk, I'll walk us through the project that brought me to the Humanities Institute, which deals with colonial botany in the Philippines. I'll share an overview of the project and select examples of material I've been working with before zeroing in on one chapter that pertains to the labors of colonial botany and superstition that I'm developing right now. And then I'll conclude with what I think expanding the notion of vernacular can mean for the history of botany. So, today, the Philippine Archipelago is speculated to host the world's highest concentration of unique species. For plants, as much as 60% are estimated to be endemic, growing nowhere else but the stretch of 7,641 islands located between the South China Sea and the Pacific Ocean. As startling as these numbers are, we can't fully recognize the weight of these figures without understanding how the territory and ideas of its botanical abundance first came to be at the intersection of colonialism, science, and nature. Before European contact, the island chain had been made up of independent ethno-linguistic groups and maritime and upland societies. It was only considered a territorial whole with the Spanish edict that claimed and then named the territory Las Filipinas after Philip II of Spain in the 16th century. Natural exploration of the archipelago soon followed, as Spanish missionaries and functionaries sought commercial resources, materia medica, agricultural products, and plants for classificatory investigation. The Philippines was a Spanish colony for over 300 years until the United States acquired the islands from Spain at the conclusion of the Spanish-American War in 1898. The US administered the colony until 1946 or so, though the islands had been occupied by Japan during World War II. Ever since I started graduate school, I've been interested in how people lay claim to plant life, the politics, the territorial assertions, and intellectual moves that imbue life with a lot of meaning. So in my current project, I'm particularly interested in the botany that occurred in the Philippines at the end of the Spanish colonial period through the US colonial period, and essentially the decades surrounding 1898. During this time, botany accelerated as an international science, especially with the first meeting of the International Botanical Congress in 1864. Spanish and US botanists began to conceptualize of phytogeographic zones with more earnest consideration, especially as the exchange of intellectual material, specimens, and publications increased as imperial metropolitan research centers engaged in more collaboration. The Philippines played an important role during the emergence of this fast internationalizing science and offers a fascinating comparative case study investigating Spanish and US colonial botanical traditions, and for more critically for me, unearthing varied expressions of plant knowledge that also existed in the archipelago during these crucial decades. And so the book I'm writing, tentatively titled Sovereign Vernaculars in the Philippines at the Dawn of New Imperial Botany, examines how Spanish and US colonial botany engaged with different forms of plant knowledge in the Philippines. I term these forms sovereign vernaculars, or insight into plants, expressed linguistically and otherwise, that revealed complex engagements with the natural environment and did not often align with the ideals of Linnaean classification. They likewise exposed the disciplinary limitations, the labor fragility, and philosophical unsteadiness of colonial botany during my period of investigation. In the science of botany, the vernacular can often refer to nomenclature or non-Latin names for plants. In my work, I invite a broadening of the definition of vernacular to think of plant knowledge as more than names that are verbally uttered, but also knowledge that is embodied, tactile, and even claimed to be supernatural. To unearth vernaculars of these sorts has required looking at all manner of material where local plant knowledge appeared: textiles, newspaper clippings, locally published intellectual production, art, poetry, music, and ostensibly word of mouth. These cultural objects and texts are important to read with colonial records and scientific publications because neither sets of materials were produced in vacuums. Botanists often grappled with the local use and significance of plants. Likewise, local intellectuals, aware of botany conventions, cherry-picked elements of the science to remind audiences of the social vitality of Philippine flora. Methodologically speaking, it's imperative that we engage in a variety of materials to execute studies into the history of colonial science, especially when local records may be fragmented, unevenly chronicled, or summarily lost. Research for this book has required going to Manila and Madrid, and I'll share some select sources I'm working with. So in the Philippines, I've conducted research on woven textiles and the tools of weaving and dyeing. At the turn of the century, weaving and dyeing were almost completely plant-based occupations, with the small exception of the introduction of synthetic dyes that hit markets in the late 1800s. Weavers were almost completely women, and an examination of designs, materials, and tools of textile production suggests that weavers worked with a base of environmental knowledge, often orally transmitted, and as historian Pamela Smith would say, evidenced through tacit expertise that transformed plants into an integrative whole. Colonial botanists often disaggregated weavers' knowledge of plants, creating indices that deconstructed the craft into constituent parts. And I believe that it is in this difference we can begin to ask questions about how botanists and weavers both altered plant life, reconstituting live plants for the herbarium sheet versus the finished textile cloth, or for the phytogeographic inventory versus the weaver's workshop. In Spain, I examined records of the Botanical Garden of Manila that was first established in 1858. During the institution's first years, a Filipino artist, pictured here, joined as the garden's head horticulturalist, though he had no formal training in botany, agriculture, or horticulture. What incites my curiosity, though, is how he helped compile seed catalogs for the garden. And in his compilation, we find the names of dozens of rice cultivars under Oryza sativa, the Latin name for common rice. Here we get a sense of local insight into other taxonomies of rice, classified along the lines of texture, taste, and culinary use. In the list itself, we also have Latinized varietal names like glutinosa or violacea that sit comfortably beside bihod, malagkit, ginalet, words that come from Philippine languages. To me, this opens a conversation on how vernacular cultivar names simultaneously challenged and existed within neat classificatory arrangement, but always already pointed to a rich environmental knowing that required sensitivity to what local taxonomies could entail, one based on different sensory measurements of plants. Now, in the United States, a number of collections have been informative, but the archives of the Mertz Library has provided some of the most compelling sources that have inspired my widened approach to the vernacular. The collections here are due in large part to Elmer D. Merrill, who had a 2-decade career in the Philippines before becoming the NYBG's director in 1930. He's been remembered as the American Linnaeus and was remarkably prolific in Philippine and wider Indo-Malayan botany. I'll focus on one story I've been uncovering here through the work of Maximo Ramos, a Filipino plant collector. Ramos was born in the province of Rizal, just northeast of the colonial capital of Manila in 1882. He caught the attention of US botanists after conducting informal botanical work on behalf of forester George P. Ahern in 1904. The NYBG carries samples from some of Ramos's earliest collections, including this 1904 specimen. And in 1907, he was hired to work as a full-time collector at the US Bureau of Science in Manila. He worked near continuously for the institution until 1920, at which point Merrill recommended him for a promotion. Merrill described him as most exceptional and absolutely fearless at visiting, quote, sparsely inhabited regions, due in part to his not being, quote, troubled by superstitions regarding mountains and forests, end quote. Most other Filipino collectors, according to Merrill, were, quote, timid and superstitious, end quote, and would not investigate more remote regions unaccompanied. Merrill's letter opens some important questions on the nature of collaboration between locally hired personnel and foreign botanists. What was to be gained from the collaboration? What sorts of superstitions had allegedly plagued most local personnel? How did the word superstition function as more than simply an epistemic judgment? Now, the Philippines is not unique in the sense that foreign botanists relied on local field assistants, usually men, to execute botanical studies. We have pages and pages in the history of science that point to the vital, though under-acknowledged role that native or locally born personnel played. In the Philippines, the US Colonial Bureau of Science hired locally born stenographers, translators, herbarium aides, collectors, stevedores, and guides to assist with operations. For field labor in particular, that is, individuals whose expertise was manifested during field explorations, there were benefits to collaborating with foreign botanists. This could include intellectual development, short and long-term employment, social prestige, personal goods, and supplies. In addition to records on collectors like Ramos, lantern slides from the Merrill collection here point to field laborers who were likely informally hired to assist with specific expeditions. For US botanists, any number of non-human and human dangers necessitated local collaboration. The Philippine climate, unfamiliar diseases, uncharted mountain terrain, and various communities, some explicitly antagonistic to colonial incursion, necessitated local personnel who could help botanists with navigation, translation, carrying supplies, and obtaining access to precious plants. For Ahern, the US forester I mentioned previously, he wrote of having hired 7 native men to row a boat for 7 hours, a task that would have, quote, surely killed a white man, end quote. The United States also had a difficult time recruiting men to travel to the archipelago, then an unfamiliar, little known and understood colony. Common lore and botany also cautioned would-be recruits with stories of violent encounters with local populations. But superstition had been, in Merrill's assessment, one of the major issues impacting recruitment of more able and willing Filipino men. In records from the period, locals reportedly revered or feared the balete tree, pictured here, are an epiphytic ficus slowly encircling its host tree, which some claim to house custodian spirits. One foreign observer suggested that the Galogs, members of one of the dozens of ethno-linguistic groups in the Philippines who accompanied him on a hunting expedition, would refuse to sleep by the balete tree. And if passing one, companions would address the tree to request permission to walk by. Others only touched and collected plants if they asked for consent. When asked to cut a tree, people would ask pardon, excuse themselves, and admit that the act was one that was compelled by a foreign party. Others refused to enter forests completely on account of dwarves that they didn't want to upset, or spirits that had long been considered guardians of particular mountain ranges. US scientists were not the only ones commenting on these sets of beliefs and practices. Superstition, superstición, pamahiin, appeared in English, Tagalog, and Spanish discourse as a scourge on civilizational progress, Christian principles, and modern education. The word carried with it a derogatory valence, usually cast against informally educated, ethnically minoritized rural peoples of a far-off older generation. But one distinction I will mention, though, is how some Tagalog writing was careful to remind that superstition was not a unique Philippine phenomenon. Farmers elsewhere in the world and historically were wont to pay homage to gods and beings that could help with harvests, for instance. Hellenic astrology was folded into superstition too, and this is a column that regularly appeared in one periodical that forecasted how a person's character would be depending on the day of the month that they were born. And for some Tagalog writers, these beliefs were to be heard with a grain of salt and reverence for that older generation that ostensibly had these beliefs, rather than be cast aside as pure idiocy. One Tagalog grammar book offered the following example sentence for students to learn the importance of the semicolon. And the sentence reads, "Let's not fully believe and listen to the myths and superstitions of our elders, but if there are good lessons and important teachings, let's listen very intently in our hearts." It's not my aim to test the veracity of the beliefs that were allegedly held, but to think about how notions of the supernatural interrupted botanical progress. I rather highlight how several of these consistently recorded animist views dealt with particular plant species, human supernatural interaction associated with environmental formations, and comportment in the forest. Superstition, then, was a way that critics recognized a vernacular of natural life. As a vernacular, these environmentally oriented rituals, expressions of reverence, and deeply held beliefs confronted botany's success in the archipelago. As I listed, many of these beliefs stood in the way of entering forests unaccompanied, collecting plants in an unfettered manner, and treading lands that were spiritually significant and could hold meaning not shared by those who didn't typically inhabit those areas. Their textual documentation also clashes with the orally transmitted nature by which many of these beliefs are typically shared, leaving us to ponder the context under which these beliefs were recorded versus how they were enacted. As historian Vince Raphael has also beautifully written, there is an untranslatability of local Philippine beliefs which don't fit neatly into a pantheon of gods, ornate mythologies, or simplified notions of good and evil. I rather think more critically then about superstition as a term, as not only a way that a vernacular belief system of the natural world was transformed by its critics, but also as a material impediment to field labor. Superstition in my reading functioned as an interruption to the physically intensive labors of botany operations. To some US colonial functionaries, superstitions were abstract beliefs that contradicted a morality cultivating faith in a Christian God, as one scholar has put it. For colonial botany, rather than only being an abstract set of beliefs considered an intellectual hindrance, superstitions were actions that made visible the fragility of field labor and foreign personnel's dependence on locally hired workers. Local collaboration was essential to survival because of menaces, seen and unseen, depending on whose vantage point you consider, on botanical fieldwork. It's important to remember that local labor could refuse work for any number of reasons. The precarious nature of verbal agreements meant that the terms of executing a particular task could be unclear or simply undesirable. While foreign researchers could offer beads, knives, cigarettes in exchange, we have records of people choosing not to work, to walk off the job, or to retaliate. Some of these refusals were met with physical instantiations of violence. independent foreign collectors would beat field guides with staffs to keep the pace of plant collection. And we have some references to this from the archives of Mary Clemens, some of whose records are also here in the Mertz Library. If we return to Maximo Ramos and his story, we also know that local men were well aware of the mortal dangers of fieldwork. During a collecting trip in 1932, Ramos fell ill while on the island of Mindanao and died suddenly among his collecting team. According to a memo sent to Merrill, Ramos died of malaria with heart complications after a brief illness during the collecting trip. The loss was a tremendous one for Philippine botany. Ramos had collected regularly with Gregorio Idano, another Filipino collector. If you visit the herbarium, you'll note that they were definitely a collecting pair, and Ramos and Idano's names appear on many herbarium sheet labels. Idano would continue to teach young students how to collect plants, and while conducting an interview in the Philippines with one of Idano's students, I learned that while Idano was teaching, decades after Ramos's death, he mentioned how Ramos died of a mysterious gastrointestinal illness and not malaria. Malaria had been mentioned and was in the official memo that we have at the NYBG, allegedly so as not to scare off would-be Filipino personnel with the danger of botanical fieldwork and to upset Ramos's widow. While I won't get into the various reasons for why these screens of distortion may exist, you're gonna have to read the chapter to find out. I read this inconsistency as to the details of Ramos's death as a parallel discourse on the labor power of colonial botany. Even if superstition could be claimed as one of the reasons that local men didn't want to conduct fieldwork, Filipino personnel, one might infer, were well aware of those threats, acting in a particular way so as not to disrupt scientific operations. These details, it would seem, were not only kept secret from would-be hires, but possibly from Merrill and other official records. This instance reminds us of how local field labor could also act in concert with the colonial botany outfit to safeguard plant collecting and to not interrupt the steady flow of local hands. It also demonstrates the stories that sit outside of the archive that are essential to recover. Many of these individuals, weavers, field guides, Filipino collectors, don't have dedicated archives of their own. But in spite of that, I do think we can recover the multiple ways people made sense of plants and how these interfaced with science personnel. Their stories point to a variety of worldviews, those that could rely on local and Latin nomenclatural conventions, see the instructive value of myth and animist belief, and even gesture to protect colonial botany operations. A methodological and conceptual commitment to the vernacular values a multiplicity of perspectives in the history of botany, and in my thinking, challenges us to read archival sources for discrepancy, frustration, complementarity, and novel thought, and to acknowledge in an ongoing way the incompleteness of archival sources in revealing the many ways we come to know, feel, and understand plant life. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Kathleen. That was truly fascinating. Very much many details to think about and discuss, and we'll do so. But first, here is our second speaker, Dr. Jackson Perry. Jackson received his degree in history from Georgetown University with a dissertation titled The Gospel of the Gum, Eucalyptus Enthusiasm and the Modern Mediterranean, circa 1848-1900. That's a study that examines the introduction of the eucalyptus tree to the Mediterranean landscape in the 19th century using sources in 6 languages, no less. And today, Dr. Perry will share the latest developments of his current book project, The Gospel of the Gum, using a double kaleidoscopic approach, adding the senses to the history of eucalyptus and its modern global diffusion. Here is Dr. Perry. Take it away.
All right, great. Thank you, Vanessa, for that warm introduction. So this morning, I'll be talking about the global history of eucalyptus. And it's unfortunate that we can't be in person for many reasons, as I would prefer to have the scent of eucalyptus hanging over the room. So if you have a eucalyptus candle or scent with you, please do go ahead and light it or plug it in. So taking in the smell of eucalyptus would unite you with the many other people, past and present, whose senses have been awoken by the distinctive fragrance of the eucalyptus. Native to Australia and a few nearby islands, eucalyptus trees cover much of the earth today. There are more than 60 million acres of eucalyptus plantations across the temperate regions of the world today, which is an area larger than the United Kingdom or twice the size of the state of New York. Eucalyptus is now one of the two most commonly planted tree genera in the world, alongside pine. Paper, biofuel, these are the common products of the wood of eucalyptus, and their oils are an important part in many medical and cosmetic products. As the world warms and the loss of natural forest continues, the domain of eucalyptus trees that have adapted to Australia's diverse and arid landscapes will probably expand further. So eucalyptus trees have become intertwined with modern human life. The common way the tree's rapid diffusion in the 19th century has been explained is to focus on the work of a few scientists living in Australia, Europe, or European imperial outposts. These so-called apostles of the eucalyptus loudly advocated for the global adoption of their favorite tree. And it's according to this standard view in the histories that these great men pursuing scientific and certain social agendas, political agendas, brought eucalyptus trees out of Australia and spread them across the world. Such accounts obviously reflect the easy availability of historical sources written by or about such men, and they are incomplete. In my work, I show that a wide range of individuals around the world, and particularly in Mediterranean environments, became enamored with the tree in the late 19th century. Not only scientists, but also landowners, state bureaucrats, religious authorities, and in particular, many common folk came to believe that its fragrances and oils could counteract or even cure malaria, which was then much more deadly and much more widespread, and much less understood for that matter than it is today. I can certainly say a whole lot more about the great eucalyptus boom of the 19th century, but in the time that I have today, I'll be following the lead of the forthcoming orchid show here at the garden. And the first kaleidoscope I'll offer today is a sensory one. When we shift our attention from the scientific elite who promoted eucalyptus to the many, many more people of lesser fame and power who sought out this novel tree from Australia and sought out its leaves, it's helpful to think of their physical, their sensory encounter with the tree, with the gospel of the gum, and to think in terms of the five senses. Preeminent among the senses in the story of eucalyptus is not surprising, it's the sense of smell. For people in Mediterranean environments in the 19th century, bad smells often meant disease. The name of the disease, malaria in English, from the Italian for bad air, is a legacy of the common way that many diseases were understood at the time, the so-called miasma theory. So the term malaria expressed both a popular and scientific understanding that swampy or marshy locations with their pungent odors, their miasmas, were sources of intermittent and pernicious fevers. In the region around Rome, farmers called the smell of the air after a warm summer rainfall, l'odore della febbre, the scent of fever, meaning malaria. And so into this olfactory universe came the eucalyptus with its distinctive balsamic fragrance. So while scientists were haggling over how precisely the eucalyptus scent counteracted malaria in the 1860s and 1870s, many people had already come to believe that the tree's fragrance could negate the miasmas coming from swamps and marshes, seeking out the leaves of the tree to make fever remedies, or seeking the seeds of the tree to plant the trees around their houses and around their farms. In this 19th century boom, People outside Australia are seeing these exotic trees for the first time with their distinctive crowns and this fascinating bark that peels off the trunk. But more than seeing the trees in the flesh, they're also reading about eucalyptus a lot. So in newspapers and scientific journals, the new transportation and communication technology of the era was making the world smaller and more accessible to readers of the growing newspaper industry of the day. The number of newspapers in many parts of the world increased dramatically over the course of the 19th century. So both information and material was moving around the world faster and faster. Descriptions of the virtues of the eucalyptus tree, of its supposed medicinal powers, could reach many new ears quickly in this era. And so I show in my work that demand for eucalyptus was cultivated by both networks of elite scientists working in botanic gardens and in this new modern media ecosystem that really threw open the doors to the halls of natural knowledge. So while the senses of sight and smell are rightly preeminent in the history of eucalyptus, the other three senses also warrant inclusion. To illustrate this briefly, let's consider an account of a conversation that took place at the Jardin des Plantes in Paris in 1865 between two botanists, one based in Paris and the other based in Valencia in Spain. So the Paris botanist is giving a tour of the museum at the garden to his colleague from Spain and points out Paris's new eucalyptus specimen. And to that, the Valencian botanist replies, "Do you call that a novelty? It may be one for you Parisians, but not for the commoners of Valencia. There, its properties are so well known as a cure for fevers that its leaves are often plundered. And in a public garden of a great city, it is necessary to surround the fever tree with a guard in order to prevent it from being stripped." So this anecdote hints at the role of other senses in the eucalyptus boom. While literacy was increasing in this period and more people could read newspapers, for most people, new natural knowledge was still being communicated by word of mouth. These conversations are not so easily captured, of course, in the sources that we historians work with, but we know they happened. And the feverish intensity that's described as happening in Valencia here could only have been possible through excited conversations among people about the potential of the new miracle tree from half the world away. These were the people whom one Spanish language newspaper patronizingly described as the commoners who suffered the most and understood the least. So in addition to sound, there's also contact with the eucalyptus and its leaves themselves happening here. So imagine these Valencians, these Spaniards, entering the garden surreptitiously, grasping for leaves of the eucalyptus, gripping them tight, and then feeling the oil exude onto their hands. And that oil represented to these believers in the gospel of the gum hope and potential freedom from fear of malaria. And this experience was replicated across the Mediterranean, where people without the financial means to buy seeds and plant the trees could nevertheless become eucalyptus enthusiasts by gathering the leaves and using them for home remedies. And home remedies, which leads us to the final sense, taste. Many eucalyptus enthusiasts were drinking teas and other beverages infused with the leaves of eucalyptus. These infusions were supposed to cure all manner of respiratory illnesses and help to reduce the intermittent fevers caused by malaria. These concoctions, as they were sometimes known at the time, competed with the consumption of quinine for malaria prevention, as these eucalyptus beverages tasted much better and induced vomiting much less often than quinine did. And there is even a group of Trappist monks outside Rome who make a eucalyptus grappa, which I can confirm has a memorably intense flavor. And one can understand why people in the 19th century, fearful of these smells, these miasmas around them, the odor of fever emanating from wetlands, could find in eucalyptus an olfactory and even gustatory source of hope. So when we consider the whole sensory kaleidoscope of eucalyptus enthusiasm, it helps to see how the mundane, normal, daily experiences of landscapes of disease environments were at the center of the broader transnational movements of scientific knowledge in the modern era. Eucalyptus enthusiasm was the product of an intense demand on a popular level in malarial environments for medical remedies and the transformation of disease environments. So that's the first kaleidoscope. Now, here at the Mertz Library, I have been revising my book manuscript and some related material. And one of the main problems that I have been thinking through here is a question that I've gotten a lot. Is my history of eucalyptus a comparative one or a transnational one? Was eucalyptus enthusiasm in the 19th century a set of contemporaneous processes in different places, or was it this entangled global moment? Now, I think, and I think my evidence supports that it was the second one, right? A transnational entangled moment, that this eucalyptus enthusiasm was a shared project of and in malarial Mediterranean landscapes by people who perceived themselves and perceived it as a single project of environmental transformation, knowledge dissemination. And so in order to make this argument stronger in my work, I've been focusing on developing more of these human and institutional connections that bridge or unite the different geographical spaces and time periods that are within my study. This brings me to my second kaleidoscope, which has to do with historical sources. So my work has required a lot of hunting and stitching together, finding mentions of eucalyptus in newspapers or in state archives that are usually about some other topic like malaria or agricultural policy. And the recent wave of digitization of books and scientific journals and the like has made this stitching together a lot easier. But for every 19th century book in Portuguese or French or Italian that's now been digitized, thanks to efforts of institutions like NYBG, there are still 100 or 1,000 that aren't digitized, particularly in non-European languages. So the physical catalog still dwarfs the digital one. And so to effectively understand the past, we as students of it still need to go to libraries and archives. So then how does the digital archive help? Its existence means that we can effectively be in two different archives at the same time. We can develop queries in a physical setting and then take those queries to the digital archive. And having these specific queries is necessary because of the sheer amount of digitized material that is available today. And in the case of eucalyptus, this specificity is needed because most archival and digital, archival and library material in the physical and the digital archive are not organized around the topic of eucalyptus, of course. So used appropriately, the physical collection and the digital collection can be overlaid like lenses in a kaleidoscope to transform our understanding of the past. And to illustrate what I mean by how we can use these two, the physical and the digital together effectively, I'm going to briefly retrace one of the journeys I have made with a text I've been relying on here at the garden. So this is a biographical encyclopedia of botanists and related individuals who worked in Italy between 1750 and 1940. There are only a few copies of this 2-volume set worldwide, and one of them is here at NYBG. And so consulting this atlas, this dictionary, is about casting a wide net, looking for eucalyptus enthusiasts that I don't yet know about, or for new details about people I'm already aware of. And remember, I'm approaching this dictionary with a broader aim of connecting different geographical spaces in a single transnational story. One of the individuals described in this atlas of Italian botanists and gardeners is Emmanuel Fenzi. He was already known to me from previous research on California as Francesco Franceschi. And in the US context, he was an Italian immigrant who lived in Santa Barbara in the 1890s and 1900s. He was a horticulturist of some prominence there, but he seemed to care more about roses than eucalyptus, so he hasn't been particularly important or interesting to me until now. But with this atlas, I see that Franceschi was a new name for him in the United States. We learn that he was an important member of the Royal Tuscan Society of Horticulture in Florence in the 1870s, when that society was a major hub of Italian eucalyptus enthusiasm. And we also learn that Fenzi in 1913 returned to Italy at the age of 70 and was then recruited by the Italian government to establish a botanic garden in Italy's new colony of Libya. He worked there for several years and then passed away in 1924. So now he's much more interesting to my interests. This fleshed out biography shows an Italian eucalyptus enthusiast who moved to California, kept working in botany there, and then returned to the Mediterranean world and became an important figure in Italian botanical efforts in North Africa. And it's at this point that the digital archive helps unlock even more valuable details about Fenzi's life. So this encyclopedia entry includes this list of articles or pamphlets that Fenzi wrote, and two stand out. First, this one that I've indicated here, A Settler's Thoughts About Agricultural Colonization, published in 1915. So this pamphlet is very difficult to track down. It's possible that the only copy is held in an archive in Florence, so that's another physical archive I'll now need to consult. But the title alone suggests that Fenzi was using his experience in California as a settler there to claim authority or prestige in Italy in 1915, as Italy is attempting to establish agricultural settlements in Libya. So perhaps he and others in Italy are seeing California and Libya as similar common ecological spaces. And then this second article I'll flag, this 1918 article on eucalyptus in Italy and Libya. Now that's a much more compelling title right off the bat, right? And a Google search shows that this was published in the Italian National Forestry Journal, which is available in a digitized form through HathiTrust and in the digital collection of the Central National Library in Rome. And so accessing this text digitally through either of these sources, we see that Fenzi wrote about his recollections of the first wave of eucalyptus enthusiasm in Italy in the 1860s and 1870s, and then leverages his experience in California to argue in favor of additional eucalyptus planting in both Italy and Libya as windbreaks for farms or as a source for timber, declaring that he's, quote, seen with his own eyes the miracles eucalyptus has wrought in California in this highlighted section. And so this research journey that I just outlined for you here, starting from the NYBG library holdings and ending in digital collections, generated not only new research insights, but new leads on archives to visit. And this was all possible sitting in one place, working over just the span of a few hours to make Fenzi's biography illustrate the broad transnational dimensions of eucalyptus enthusiasm, and also exemplify how people and natural knowledge moved between different yet similar Mediterranean spaces at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. And I have two final takeaways to offer from working through my work kaleidoscopically with you today. First, thinking about all of the senses together emphasizes an individual and a collective experience of nature and new natural knowledge that is embodied, and shows how mundane embodied experience can generate actions and events and processes of world historical significance. And also this sensory history is best understood as overlaid. Sight and smell, touch, taste, feel, and limitations in one's abilities in those areas for that matter, all combine to shape an individual's experience of new natural phenomena. And the second takeaway is that we have to be agile or nimble in our historical research these days. When we're working with data in these kinds of unpredictable digital and physical clumps and circumstances, we have to be careful about how we approach or how we layer the data kaleidoscopically. We have to always be thinking about what lenses might be missing and what new materials in what physical or digital repositories might deepen and enrich our understanding of the past. Thank you very much.
Well, Jackson, thank you so much for this remarkable kaleidoscopic overview. I'm sure the audience will have many questions, and I'm very pleased to hand over the mic now to my colleague Charles Zimmerman, who will coordinate the Q&A session. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, and thanks again to the audience for joining us today. I just want to remind everyone here, please add your questions to the Q&A. You can click the Q&A button at the very bottom to access that. And if you see questions that others have already asked that you would also like to see mentioned today, go ahead and upvote those. That helps us a lot to get through the list. So yeah, let's get right to it and see what some of our audience members have been sharing. So Kat, this is a question for you. So this is from Doug. How much of Ramos and Idano's botanical output was destroyed during World War II? Do you know much about the history of those collections and the impact that might have been had by that conflict?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And hi, Doug. Thank you for asking that. What was in the Philippines was absolutely destroyed, right? So the Philippine National Herbarium was razed during World War II. And so hundreds of thousands of materials, I think it was over 200,000 specimen sheets were completely obliterated. And really, Idano and Ramos were collecting up till about, well, when Ramos died, right, to the 1930s. What we do have, though, are their collections in other herbaria. And so in the United States, especially wherever kind of Merrill landed, including Berkeley, the NYBG, and in Harvard, some of their specimens are there, thankfully. And the Philippines has tried to repatriate some specimens as well, especially following World War II, to repopulate its collection. And so some actually might be there, but thank goodness for digital herbaria that actually make that much more accessible to me to be able to find.
Thank you, Kathleen. And yeah, that is a great connection. There is a hope for some things to access them digitally that is very challenging when you just have physical specimens. That's absolutely true. Jackson, I have a question next for you. What are your thoughts on the eucalyptus's emergence as a houseplant? Do you think that trend is tied to the wellness market or any of these other patterns that you've seen in your historical research?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think the rise of eucalyptus as a houseplant is perhaps an indicator that the wellness craze of recent years or decades isn't actually that new, right? That people have long been seeking out botanical methods to improve their surroundings, their sort of physical and mental well-being. And there's something quite democratic, I think, about the transition that eucalyptus has undergone since the 19th century. When to benefit from the eucalyptus, you might have had to actually buy and plant the tree, which was a cost-prohibitive choice for a lot of people. But now people are able to benefit from the perceived virtues of the eucalyptus just by buying a plant or buying the scent in some other form, right? So yeah, there's something broadly long-term about this historical arc that isn't just tied to a recent wellness craze.
Thank you for that perspective, Jackson. I appreciate that. We'll go back to Kat for this next question. How do you approach balancing your own biases while reading archives for the biases of others to uncover an authentic narrative of the histories and experiences of fieldwork?
Yeah, oh, that's such a good question. And one that I think is common in the history discipline. I mean, I think not only in the history of botany are we kind of working with different ways our historical interlocutors are interpreting the past or plant species or other people, but pretty much every other topic that we're trying to really get into, right? I think as a feminist science studies scholar, I really kind of forefront the biases that I come in with and acknowledge that I look through the world with a particular set of lenses, right? At the same time, the history that I'm writing, I don't know if I would strive to say that's authentic history to the experience of field laborers and botanists, but it's certainly one history that I can glean from the sources that I'm able to pull together, the empirical materials that are at least pointing to how I might be able to shape that story. It's not a moralizing tale that I'm trying to write either, although, that might come through in the way that I might interpret many of my materials too. But I think especially when it comes to something as tricky and as delicate as social history, when you're trying to write on people who've left very little textual evidence behind, bringing that kind of to the fore comes with a whole other set of considerations for being really delicate, respectful, and always continually aware again of the kind of things that you want to read into that past that I'm pretty aware of. And also having really good colleagues to kind of look through my work too, to see where I might be impressing myself more into those materials than they might be showing is incredibly key. Thanks for that question.
Thank you for your answer. That's terrific. Going back to Jackson, talking about the eucalyptus, we've got a nice balance of questions here. This is very good. To what extent is the growth rate exhibited by eucalyptus? Possibly, to what extent could that have helped it as well to expand across the world? And in a follow-up, how was the conflict between water demands of eucalyptus and its role as a medicine?
Yeah, sure. So to answer those questions, I think I'll start with the second one first, chronologically speaking, because the water demands of eucalyptus actually made it seem like it might be effective against malaria, right? Because even though people in the mid-19th century didn't understand the relationship between mosquitoes and malaria, nevertheless, people recognized that reducing the amount of standing water through the thirsty eucalyptus was a way to potentially reduce the rate of malaria in an area, or the rate of miasmatic fevers for that matter. So if anything, medicine was a direct way that eucalyptus could have prevented malaria, but the draining powers of planting a lot of eucalyptus in a geography was also a way to eliminate fevers. And then as for the growth rate, this is something that's more a case in the 20th century, is that the prodigious growth rate of eucalyptus is why it has become such a popular tree for biofuels and for paper, because eucalyptus plantations turn around at a much faster rate than pine plantations do. And so in temperate areas and tropical areas, you can plant eucalyptus and reap benefits within multiple times within an individual lifetime, rather than having to think on a much longer term basis.
Thank you for that answer. That's great. Ella is asking a question next for Kathleen. Oh, I'm sorry. I was looking at the wrong one. This is from Matthew, actually. How do you approach text sources versus herbarium specimens? And are there insights that specimens allow that texts and other sources do not? And how does this influence your work? And really, this could be a question for either speaker. But
yeah,
Kat, we'd like to go first.
Oh, that's great. No, thank you for the question, Matthew. They say a lot. I gotta say, they say a lot. Once again, for people that maybe don't have dedicated archives of their own, although maybe we can start shifting that thinking for someone like Ramos, whose archive is in the herbarium, right? And so I think of it both in a creative way, right? So both in a creative way and in a kind of a historical, empirical way. Creatively, I might be able to sort of describe how he, collected a particular specimen and what he took care to include for a particular sheet to give a little bit more animation, I think, to his story, right? That becomes really good for writing with. Empirically, I might look at the collecting dates and notice that, or collecting information on the labels and notice that, for instance, his earliest collections come from his hometown, which to me would suggest that he was hired in the locality, to work. And we know that he was hired informally. And so that's just, again, one bit that might suggest to me where he came from and how he kind of fell into botany. And then when it comes to sort of the history of Philippine plants as they're traveling globally, I absolutely look at the specimen labels to see where these plants are moving and to see which repositories are holding them. And that's where, in connection to Doug's question, I was able to find out how plants were being repatriated after World War II from places like Madrid or places like Harvard to really come back to rebuild a collection that had been absolutely destroyed. How about you, Jackson?
Yeah, I think the material that I find most useful for my work is when gardens keep lists of where they've gotten seeds from and who sent them there, and then also separately seed catalogs so that I can show the market for eucalyptus developing in a particular locality as a function of my being interested in the broader demand ecosystem that existed in Mediterranean societies for eucalyptus.
Terrific, thank you. It's always great hearing how researchers use sources and what things are important. We've actually had several participants chime in the chat mentioning that they participate in projects to help digitize collections at the garden. So those efforts are tremendously important and impactful. So thank you all for doing your part. I'm going to transition to a question that's, again, I think directed towards both of you. First of all, Kat, when are you releasing your next book? Our participants really would like to know. And Jackson, where can they find the write-ups, the work that you've been doing? Where is that going to be available to folks in the audience, and when?
Yeah, I think I feel my heart palpitating really hard. I'm working on it. This is why I have the time here, though, to work on the manuscript, which is great. And then hopefully it'll be out for review either for a manuscript workshop or with the publisher in the coming year. It's a little hard to say right now. COVID has really meant a lot of delays, not only on the writing end, but also on the review end. But I'm kind of hoping that at least in the next couple of years, it should hit shelves. But I'm continually working through parts of the chapters. Very happy to talk about these at a future date too. So feel free to reach out.
Yeah, and I'll add similarly. That the book question is one that's slightly intimidating. So I would say on that front, check the New York Botanical Garden store in maybe 3 years or so. As for other shorter writings, I have an article out about eucalyptus and sparrow plagues in Algeria that I think is quite fascinating. It's behind a paywall, but shoot me an email and I'll be happy to share it. And then I have some other open source, open access, shorter publications that are available as well. But anyone who's interested in talking to me more about eucalyptus, feel free to shoot me an email. And I'll be happy to talk about eucalyptus further.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Vanessa, I think that will conclude our Q&A for the day. Do you want to close this out?
Yes, indeed. Wow, this has been quite an hour. Thank you all for your very interesting conversations. And as you all can see, audience, we are continuing the work here at the New York Botanical Garden. Kathleen and Jackson, thank you again for sharing all these latest discoveries and new thoughts. We all look forward indeed to your publications. And audience, thank you for joining us today. And if you missed any part of this event, you can, it has been saved and it will be shared online in the New York Botanical Gardens lecture library. And for those who haven't already registered for our mailing list, please go ahead and sign up using the link in the chat at the end. Please join us again for upcoming humanities lectures held on site at the New York Botanical Garden further down in the spring. On March 25th, there's the seminar Bronx Garifuna Food Traditions, Keeping Connected. And on April 15, we'll continue our popular food dialogues, this year celebrating African American farmers. Everyone, until next time, please stay well, stay green, and take good care. Goodbye, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Take care, everyone.